Thank you, Goddard, and thank you all of you for being here. I was having dinner in your wonderful cafe, and I can tell you, you're lucky to have good food in a cafe. Because we're living in times not just of fake news, we're living in times of fake food. And this little child came and gave me these 2 seeds. She didn't know who I am. Her father had greeted me. And she said, tell her seeds are important. And I think that is where, for me, hope is. Hope is in the seed, but hope is in the fact that even though no one is going to the schools and telling young children, this little seed holds the future of life and the promise of solutions to everything, you know. I've met Greta, and I keep telling her, Greta, it's not enough to strike on the Fridays. We've got to grow the gardens the rest of the week. In every school, in every community, and of course every garden begins with the seed. But how did I end up dedicating my life to the seed? You know, I'm basically originally trained in physics. And I chose to do a PhD in the foundations of quantum theory. Because for me, a mechanical view of the universe was very unsatisfactory. It didn't ever make sense. It didn't make sense in the discipline of physics, because by now we had quantum theory, by now we had relativity theory, but it didn't make sense in the real world. So I decided to go deeper into understanding the quantum world. And while I was about to leave for my PhD in Canada, and I went to Canada because the top minds who were working on quantum theory had been attracted to a university. From all over, I wrote to Australian scientists, and they were in Western. I wrote to Polish scientists, they were in Western. British scientists, they were in Western. Israeli scientists, they were all in Western, University of Western Ontario. So I said, well, that's where I'll go. And I was required to do a second master's. I'd done a master's in physics, so I had to do a second master's also in philosophy. I'm grateful I did it, because I learned basic terms like epistemology and ontology, which you don't learn in physics. You know, epistemology is ways of knowing, and ontology is what exists. So before leaving, I decided to trek in some of my favorite forests and take my home with me, because I'd grown up in the Himalayan forest. And I chose the forest that was closest to Delhi so I could go visit, take my flight. And this forest was gone. It had been converted for development into an apple orchard. And the stream that came from that oak forest, in which I used to swim as a child, was a trickle. The water reached my ankles. So I'm coming back to Delhi, and I'm sitting in this tea shop. We have these dhabas in India. And I'm telling the dhabawala, I said, I'm so disturbed about the disappearance of the forests. And he said, but there's hope now, because Chipko has started. And I asked, what's Chipko? And he said, well, women are coming out and saying, we are going to hug the trees. Chipko means to hug. And we are not going to let you cut the trees. You'll have to kill us before you kill the tree. And this movement, which started around the time when I was leaving for Canada, then spread, and I took a commitment that I would come back every vacation, summer, winter, summer, winter. I'd keep doing my quantum theory till I finished my PhD, and every holiday I would volunteer for this movement. So I always say I've done a PhD at the University of Western Ontario, which then gave me a second honorary doctorate for my work on intellectual property and the seed issue, much later. But my real doctorate is with the peasant women who've never been to school. Everything I've learned about biodiversity, I learned from them. But the 2 things that were common between my learning of quantum theory, as well as what I learned through the Chipko movement, was what was the subject of my PhD thesis, non-separability. The mechanical world is about separation, you know. Every particle is separate. This glass and this bottle can only make contact directly, physical contact. They can't impact each other otherwise. And what this glass is and what this glass is absolutely fixed. Well, quantum theory totally turns that worldview on its head because everything is related. If these are two particles, you can never separate them. You change the state of this, it's going to change the state of that. That creates action at a distance and non-separation. But that this glass, if it was a particle, could be a wave. So instead of fixed entities, you realize everything is potential. Yeah? And what the potential will unfold to is defined by the context. In quantum theory, it's defined by how you measure. You measure for a particle, you'll find a particle. You measure for a wave, you'll get the wave. In society, it's the context we create. That is why the current issues of so-called austerity are extremely important, because the context of welfare, the context of equity, the context of sharing creates different kinds of human beings who don't have to live in daily fear and in daily hate, which can then be tapped as the capital for politics. And that's the subject of my new book. Actually, the book, Seeding the Future, is just a different title of the same book. And Shiva is my son, because I wrote to him from Paris. I said, something's gone wrong. Bill Gates is standing on the stage with heads of state, but he's just a billionaire. Since when did he get this kind of political power? And him and Zuckerberg were standing on the stage and offering technical solutions to climate change. The two big things for them was geoengineering, engineering the planet, as if we haven't messed it up enough. And the second was genetic engineering. And I have large sections in this book to show that when Bill Gates says he is financing invention for climate resilience, all he's doing is stealing the kinds of seeds we have saved for tolerance to flooding, tolerance to salt, which comes with the cyclones and hurricanes, and tolerance to drought. This is not an invention. It is biopiracy. It's a name I gave to this phenomena before it started to happen. Because when I took all my learning from quantum theory and from the women of Chipko and applied it to trying to figure out what was going on in agriculture. Agriculture wasn't my field, but in 1984, and it's a very Orwellian year, two disasters took place in my country. On 4th of June, the military was sent to the Golden Temple, which is the sacred shrine of the Sikhs, the religion that wears the turban. It's, I think, 600 years this year of the founding of that religion. And the army, in name, was sent to control a terrorist, but reality was on 4th of June, the farmers were protesting. And had said, I've written this in my book that came out of that period called The Violence of the Green Revolution. And the farmers were saying that when you can't choose what you grow or how you'll grow it, you can't decide the price of what you will sell, what you've grown. You can't decide when the water of your rivers will reach your field. Then you're living under conditions of slavery. And we want to be free of the slavery. So the protests of the farmers that were at their peak had declared on 4th of June they weren't going to supply grain to Delhi till the slavery ended. That day the army was sent and the narrative became terrorism. And in fact, my book, The Violence of the Green Revolution, could not be published. I had to self-publish it because any writing on Punjab was banned, Because as a result of sending army to the sacred shrine, the Sikhs got very angry and then assassinated Indira Gandhi, our prime minister. And then every writing on Punjab was banned. And so Punjab is now a dark hole of history where most people don't understand why things went the way they did and why they continue to unfold in a certain way. My book was based on primary research, and interestingly, I had to cancel about 4 trips to Punjab. I knew Punjab because I'd done my MSc honors in physics there, and it was a peaceful state. But when I was doing the research, and I was doing the research for the United Nations University, if I was going by bus, buses were canceled because a bus had been blown up. If I was going by train, the trip was canceled because the railway tracks had been blown up. And this was daily. 30,000 people were killed in that violence. And that same year, on the night of 2nd December, morning of 3rd December, this year is 35 years, in the city of Bhopal, a gas leaked from a pesticide plant and killed, according to local people, 20,000 people that night. People still, I was there before leaving on this trip, and the people call that night, the night when Bhopal was turned into a gas chamber. Now, none of the people of Bhopal know about the gas chambers in Hitler's Germany. But that's the metaphor they use. And even now, 35 years later, children are being born deformed with huge numbers of birth defects. My sister, who's a doctor, was telling me the most recent study, which is being held back by the Indian Council of Medical Research, shows 600% higher birth defects in Bhopal, where this was impacted. So I wrote to the UNU and I said, this is something, I was working on conflicts over resources. I said, this is something that needs investigation. And would you let me take it up? And we did. And that's when I found my friends, Monsanto and company, and I've called them the poison cartel. Because this tiny group is the group that worked for Hitler. So it was IG Farben and their partners in America. And the interesting thing was, the countries were fighting, but the companies were working together. So Monsanto, America was fighting Germany, but Monsanto and Bayer had a company called Mobay. And Dow and DuPont working together. You then had the Nuremberg trials, etc. But they are now down to a cartel of 4, controlling all chemicals and all seeds in agriculture. Interestingly, my work on seed, which was basically triggered by my work on the Green Revolution in Punjab, which showed that the soils had been destroyed, the water had been destroyed. There's a cancer train that leaves Punjab. The chemical use is so intense. And the suicide rates among farmers are very high. So I started to get invited to meetings on the future of agriculture, the future of biotechnology, and it was a meeting of 1987 where the poison cartel was saying, we're not making it, and they weren't concentrated again. There were many companies because antitrust law had split them. But now with so-called competition of globalization, they're big again. And they were talking about not making enough money from chemicals. They said, we will need to use the new technologies of recombinant DNA, genetic engineering, because now we'll claim we've made a new life form. And the laws they were trying to frame, and I was here in the European Parliament to fight that law. I think it was it's been 89, a law on biotechnology, where they were talking about novel organisms, and they've created a new life form, and therefore they can own it and patent it. And the 2 other things they said at that meeting was, that it's not enough that we have Europe and the US, because most farmers are in the South. So we must have an international law. And that's what became the intellectual property law, the TRIPS agreement of the WTO. Second thing they said, by the turn of the century, we will be 5, controlling food and health. Now, I mentioned there 4. At that meeting, there was SIBA, there was Sandoz. They were separate. They've all merged. SIBA, Sandoz, AstraZeneca merged to become Syngenta, and now Syngenta has merged with ChemChina. Dow and DuPont have merged, and they have bought Union Carbide, that was responsible for the Bhopal tragedy. Monsanto and Bayer, which were Mobay during that time, have merged. And BASF is an interesting company because every time they get stuck because of monopoly, they put a section of their business into BASF. So it's like the garbage can, you know? But they're all linked. They all have licensing arrangements. They're not separate. Now, in this book, when I saw Bill Gates standing there with the heads of state, and I told my son something's changing, and he quickly did research, went into, you know, you young people are so smart at getting into websites that aren't supposed to be accessible. And he collected this amazing data that showed that in this very short time, since globalization and free trade, which deregulated commerce, deregulated finance, and deregulated the corporations, that's the period when the group, not only did the consolidation of companies increase, but the emergence of the billionaires is seen. And the reason I call them robber barons is because we had a similar rule of robber barons when Rockefeller controlled all the oil of the world through one company, Standard Oil. And Standard Oil had a company called Standard Oil IG Farben. Again, while the people are made to fight, the companies had joined hands. So Standard Oil controlled oil. The Germans were doing the chemistry, but every chemical used in those labs then and later was a chemical that's based on fossil fuels. Chemical fertilizers, synthetic pesticides, all derived from. So it is a fossil fuel agriculture. People think these chemicals come out of nowhere. In the case of chemical fertilizers, the story is so clear. So they had figured out how to use fossil fuels to burn at very high temperatures and fix atmospheric nitrogen. And this is the basis of making explosives and making ammunition, which is why so many of the bombs today are fertilizer bombs. You remember the young man who killed people in Norway? He had been buying sacks of fertilizers in the months before. And the bombs he made was with fertilizer. Oklahoma bombing, fertilizer bomb. All of the Afghanistan bombing, fertilizer bombs. Because the Americans were giving sacks and sacks and sacks of chemical fertilizer to the Taliban to try and get them away from the Soviets. There was a Soviet Union in those days. And now those sacks of fertilizer are lying around to be turned into bombs and explosives again. For 1 kilogram of a synthetic fertilizer, you need 2 liters of diesel. And most of the time, you know, the language has been so shrunk on climate change. First of all, it's as if climate change is the only problem, but climate change is a consequence. It's a result of doing things. But the result of doing those things has not just resulted in the buildup of atmospheric greenhouse gases, of which nitrous oxide is a big one, 300 times more deadly than carbon dioxide. And the other is methane, and of course carbon dioxide. But long before those emissions happen, you've already destroyed the biosphere. You've already destroyed the small farms. You've already desertified the land. You've already mined the water. So, in fact, I would say in physics terms, emissions are a secondary impact. The primary impact is on the land. And I realized that this bit of the land was totally disappearing in the discussion, and it was all about the atmosphere. As if the biosphere and the atmosphere don't have a relationship, as if the land and the air are not interconnected. So in the lead up to Copenhagen Summit on Climate Change, I wrote this book, Soil Not Oil, to show these connections. Finally, 10 years later, people are realizing, A, that industrial farming is a big part of the problem, and my research is showing about 50% now of all greenhouse gas emissions comes from the way we grow and distribute and process our food. Yeah? Whether it's the production systems, the fossil fuels, the chemical fertilizer. I mean, in the United States, it's no more agriculture, because agriculture means care for the land. Yeah? In the US, it is images of warfare. The size of those giant machines, the spraying of poisons, and that whole system is now being played out so big. Europe, before globalization, used to be a land largely of small farms. I remember France was a big player in the WTO agreements, and I used to be called to France by the government then. They are losing their small farms. And everywhere you're getting the bulldozing of the land to grow monocultures of commodities. Are they feeding the world? No. If you look at the canola, you look at the corn, which is the big crop that's spreading in Europe, it's mainly going to biofuel and animal feed. 90% of the expansion of corn and soya is for animal feed and biofuel, not for food, which is why 1 billion people are starving. But it isn't just 1 billion people who are starving. 2 billion, according to the United Nations, are not sure if they'll eat, and they're saying what we were surprised is earlier we did hunger studies, it was all in the South. Now the vulnerability studies are showing large amounts of hunger in the North. In rich countries, America, England, every 6th child, every 7th child doesn't know if they'll be able to eat. Food deserts is a new language we've created. Yeah? And food deserts isn't because America is the Sahara. The food desert is created by a distorted system of production, which is non-sustainable, and an even more distorted system of distribution. So last year, it was last year. Time moves so fast, it's impossible to think. We did a report on the future of our daily bread to try and understand what the future of agriculture was going to look like. Of course, in this book already, I had written that, so the chemical industry, as I mentioned, came out of the war and came out of the concentration camps. And as a scientist, I say, okay, what is it that they are skilled at? What is their knowledge? And it's the knowledge of killing. First human beings, and then insects and plants. Every weedicide, Roundup, Agent Orange, its aim is to kill plants. In the case of Agent Orange, it was to kill the forest so you could see where the Viet Cong are and bomb their villages. And Roundup and glyphosate, which is the big debate of our times, Monsanto never made it. Some Swiss scientists had found it and had really made it for cleaning pipes. You know, pipes started to accumulate metals, and it is really a cleaner. And it's cleaner because it binds metals, it's, you know. and a scientist. Somehow he spilled the chemical, and the grass died. So Monsanto patented it, bought the patent, and then patented it as a weedicide. Didn't even know how it works. Of course, started to say it's safe, but in 1984, they already knew it causes cancer in the United States. Monsanto knew. It's come out in these big cases on cancer in the discovery. All the papers are coming out, you know. And in 84, they knew it causes cancer. Then the World Health Organization showed that it is carcinogenic. And of course, what is the response? The industry lobbied the White House. I always say White House is an extension of the poison cartel. It has no independent existence. And they just do what they're told to do. The chemical industry started to want to own the seed and control the seed, and that's where my work on the seed started. So in that 87 meeting, on the flight back, you know, I'm thinking to myself, what does it mean when 5 companies control life? And how can we deal with it? And I realized it was an empire for life. You know, I called it bioimperialism. And how do you deal with it? So I have learned a lot from our freedom movement, especially Gandhi's inspiring actions. And there were 2 things that came to my mind from our freedom movement. The first was that we were part of the British Empire. And the British Empire was an empire of cotton. The British Empire basically was built on the fact that India used to be a very wealthy country. We were 25% of the world economy, and our wealth was based on textiles and spices. And in those days, a sack of pepper used to have to be exchanged for a sack of gold. A sack of indigo, the natural dye, was exchanged for a sack of gold. So of course, the colonizers wanted it, and the first colonizer was Spain, and Columbus with his charter. And interestingly, while I was working on the issue of patenting, I wanted to know the roots of the word patent. I said, what does it mean? And I realized that what Columbus was given by King Ferdinand and Queen Isabel was a letter patent. And a letter patent means an open letter. An open letter is something you can open up and show. It's a declaration. Whereas most of the time in Europe, letters used to be closed, sealed letters of conspiracy for warfare. So the open letter was for conquest, to say, if arrive on any land, I mean, that's what the charter said, that's what later the papal bull said. Any land which is not ruled by white Christian princes, take it over on our behalf. And I said, oh, so what they did with land in 1492 is what they want to do with life. And the legal jurisprudence created then, after that, was terra nullius, the empty land. And the theory was, if the land doesn't have white Christians, then it's empty because the others, we are subhuman. You know? Yeah. Even, I mean, till 20 years ago, the Encyclopedia Britannica used to say that the Australian Aboriginals are not human, they are part of fauna and flora. Yeah? And in the early days, if you look at the museums, you know, they used to put blacks in cages. They're not really human. The reason we can own them is they're not like us. They're subhuman. Yeah? So if the land was emptied at that time in the first colonialism, in effect, life was being emptied in our time. But even Columbus was actually coming to India. And that's why when he landed in the Americas, he decided to call the native people Indians. He thought he landed in India. Yeah. So all the different indigenous cultures of America are called Indians. But of course, they then colonized the Americas, and 1492 to 1600, 100 years later, the British, having a deep inferiority complex, said, we'd better get the wealth. And they absolutely copied the charter of Columbus in the charter given to the East India Company by Queen Elizabeth and 300 merchant adventurers. The right to create private armies, the right to conquer other lands, and the creation, the difference between the Spanish conquest and the East India Company was, East India Company was the first corporation created. It's a break in human history. It's the birth of the corporation. And the idea of the limited liability corporation is basically that when the ship will go to get the pepper or the gold or whatever you're trying to get, if it stays with you, all the profits are yours. But at that time, it's not that the Belgians were not in India, but the French were, the Portuguese were. And they used to pirate each other's ships all the time. So I remember I was traveling in Orissa once, in Orissa and Bengal, and there was a canal here, and there was a canal just a few feet away. And I said, why are they making two canals so close to each other? Because I thought they were for irrigation. And then the people explained to me this was the British canal, and that was the French canal, and they were a cannonball distance away, so they couldn't attack each other. Yeah. So East India Company as a limited liability corporation meant that when the ship was looted by another country's pirates, society paid the losses. So the company never lost. And what I see happening today is a movement towards total control and zero liability. And they're calling it, there's a whole new jugglery going on called zero budget. And we have a new report, I suggest you go to it. It's called The Future of Food. And it's about the new rush to push fake foods at a time where everyone wants real food. A new rush to further concentrate control over agriculture. So Monsanto bought the world's biggest climate data corporation. And then they bought the world's biggest soil data corporation. And now, of course, they've been bought by by Bayer. Bayer is buying the world's, and they also bought the world's biggest pollinator research station. So Bayer is buying a lot of the microbial data research. And that's why you have the new language now of digital agriculture, and Monsanto is talking about farming without farmers. And they're increasingly now talking about food without food. But the problem is, fake news can help strange people become heads of our governments. But fake food kills you. And we've done a manifesto called Food for Health. It's available on the Navdanya International website. And I want to just give you the figures of the damage to health. So there are a whole new group of diseases that are called non-communicable chronic diseases. And these diseases are really, they're exploding. The graph is exponential. And they're totally related to how we grow food and the toxics we use in food and the deficiencies in our food. But I'll just run through quickly the costs of these new chronic diseases. So neurodegenerative. And let me just take an aside, because you're brilliant people who are going to turn all this into So when Monsanto said, oh, Roundup is safe, and they said it can't affect humans, they lied. They lied first because they knew that it was a carcinogen. But they also knew that the way the plant gets disrupted and killed when you spray Roundup is it ruptures a metabolic pathway called the shikimate pathway. And they said, well, our cells don't have it, but we are not only human cells. Only 10% of us are human cells. 90% are microbial-baked microbes in our gut. 100 trillion of them, on one estimate. So we are walking microbes, actually. And these 100 trillion amazing microbes have totally diverse diets. And when we eat diverse food, they create new enzymes. Those enzymes create new processes. We don't eat neurological neurotransmitters. Yeah? It's our gut that creates neurotransmitters. So when our gut bacteria are attacked because they have the shikimate pathway with Roundup residues, they are not producing the enzymes that are producing the neurotransmitters. And so you see a rise in Alzheimer's. I grew up in childhood where the old people were the smartest in remembering what's happened. And today, everyone above 40, 50, 60, Alzheimer's. America is going to have 1 in 2 kids who are autistic on the data that, on the graph that's growing. So, neurodegenerative diseases, 2.54 trillion is the cost. Autism, 171 billion. Cancer, 2.5 trillion. Diabetes, 2.5 trillion. Endocrine disruption to 549 billion. Infertility, even in India, you see rows and rows and rows of infertility clinics. 3.6 billion. Antibiotic resistance infections, 1 trillion. Obesity, 1.2 trillion. I've just come through from Mexico through the US. It's amazing what these diets are doing. Suddenly human beings have totally different bodies in places where the human diet has changed dramatically. Obesity is 1.2 trillion, birth defects 22.9 billion. So we are talking about a disaster. The people who are dying for lack of food is 1. But the people who are dying directly with poison is 200,000, according to the UN Rapporteur on Food, who's the one who followed Oliver de Schutter. She's just done a report. But if you look at what's happening to the planet, as I mentioned, 50% of the greenhouse gases come from the way we grow our food and the way we distribute it. 75% of the destruction of land, and a large part of the refugee crisis is the destruction of land. Yeah? We've done a report called Terra Viva in the Year of Soil. It's called Our Soil, Our Commons, Our Future. And we were trying to connect the issue of soil with the huge exodus of people, including from Syria, because in 2009, they had had a severe drought. But a chemical-intensive agriculture had drained the groundwater. The wells were empty. 1 million people moved into the cities as refugees. But in 2 years, people who wanted to sell arms and control the oil had taken over, and now half of Syria is refugees. But even Lake Chad has disappeared because 90% of the lake is not being allowed, water of the lake is not being allowed to go to the lake, but it's growing commodity crops. And another aspect of my work has shown that industrial chemical farming uses 10 times more water. And that's a big reason for the water crisis. So 75% of the water crisis is because of this. 92% of all cultivated agriculture, diversity has disappeared. Insects, they're now talking about an insectagadon. 80% species of insects have disappeared in the last 30 years. because of the spread of chemicals. So what we do, what I started to do in '84 was I said, I'm not going to participate in a violent agriculture. I'll promote a non-violent farming. I had no idea what non-violent farming looks like. So I did all the research on organic and everything. '87 onwards, I took a pledge, I'm going to save seeds. Because, as I mentioned, Gandhi, on the one hand, said, we are going to fight the cotton empire by spinning our own cloth. And he pulled out the spinning wheel. And I drew a matrix on my little notebook, and I said, empire of cotton, the raw material cotton, the processing spinning wheel, empire over life, and I kept thinking of what the spinning wheel, and it's the seed that came to me. So I started to save seeds. But I started to work with my government to make sure we didn't pass laws, Monsanto laws. And I thought it would be a 10-year affair and be over, but no matter how much. So we have a law, 3J, plants, animals, and seeds are not human inventions. Makes sense, doesn't it? Monsanto finds it very troublesome because they want it recorded as seeds are self-replicating machines invented by Monsanto. And generations down, it's their self-replicating machine that was stolen by a farmer. But the second thing was, we said, even if Monsanto gets its way, we will not cooperate. So Gandhi's word for this is satyagraha, the fight for truth. And of course, he did many. In 1906, he started one against the apartheid regime of dividing South Africa by race, because he was a lawyer in South Africa. And in India, on the indigo, Indian peasants were being forced to grow indigo while they were starving. And then the salt laws, where the British said, oh, if we have a monopoly on salt, we'll make so much money. And he walked to the beach, picked up the salt from the sea, and said, nature gives it for free. We need it for our survival. We will not obey your laws. We will continue to make salt. So I said, a seed is given by nature and our ancestors, and we need it for our survival. And we will not obey any law that prohibits farmers from saving and exchanging seed. And so we started also the seed satyagraha. We created seed banks all over India. We've created 140. And when I would tell people, oh, there are 300 varieties there and 200 varieties there, people would say, can't be. And I'd say native seeds produce more, and they'd say, can't be. So I said, okay, I'll have a place where all this is available, so they can see with their own eyes, and the can't be becomes a can be. And so we have this farm that has grown into a beautiful place. We grow on this farm 740 varieties of rice, 250 varieties of wheat, every kind of pulse and legume, all kinds of vegetables, including the vegetables we don't have to plant, because when you're not spraying Roundup, all kinds of plants feed you. And the uncultivated edibles, to me, are one of the biggest blessings. And it isn't just the edibles, they're the medicinal plants. Like there's a plant that grows in the monsoon on our fields. It's called the Philanthus neruri, only cure for liver diseases. Now, part of all of this also has been the fight against biopiracy, which is the taking away of knowledge and resources of others and claiming it to be your invention. Because once you've declared you can have a patent on a plant or seed, biopiracy is inevitable. So in 1984, when I started the campaign on Bhopal, I started a campaign called No More Bhopals, Let's Plant a Neem. Because neem is a beautiful tree we've always used. For pest control, we put it in woolens. We put it in our grain bins. We spray it. And 10 years later, we find it's patented. And I'm remembering my dear friend Magda Elvert, who used to be the president of the Greens in European Parliament. And Magda and Linda Bullard, who was the president of the organic movement, but also living here in Belgium. And I said, I'll do all the work, we'll do the mobilization, but I can't keep coming to Europe. And part of what I've done all my life is not be stopped for lack of money. So I said, if you can take on the case in Munich, I'll do everything from India. So I collected 100,000 signatures. We did all the research. We sent all the farmers. We sent all the scientists for evidence in the European Patent Office. We won in the first round, and then they challenged. And the US government and Grace, the company, were jointly, had a joint patent, and were jointly challenging our win. And I remember in the hearing, the opening hearing I had gone, and they put their finger like this and said, "She cannot be here," they're telling the judge. And the judge asked, "Why not?" And it's because she's not an American. So the judge asked, "Do you have something to say?" I said, "No, are they, Your Honor?" Because they were Americans. "No, she's not a European." I said, "No, are they?" Because they're Americans. And of course, the judge went on. We then won the appeal. And I remember that too, because it was Women's Day, 8th of March, 2005, I think it was. And the judge said, "You can go for lunch break and you'll get the decision after we come back." And he said just one sentence, because 3 of us were there together, Magda and Linda and I. And all we had was love and friendship and trust and a common commitment. And he just said, "Congratulations, you won. Happy Women's Day." And that was the end of that story. But I want to say just 2 things, because when we were talking, you had mentioned that the ecofeminism issue is a big concern. So what I've learned over these many years, now 45 years, is we've been dominated by a worldview, and not too old. It's colonialism and the fossil fuel worldview and the mechanistic worldview, just added up in layers, which has built on 2 false assumptions. The first assumption is nature is dead and just raw material to be exploited. And that word of emptiness continues to travel. So terra nullius to bio nullius to what I would call now mente nullius, where the entire new set of robber barons are mining our brains, and we are the new raw material for them. You know, the whole mining of information and data is that. But when I read the literature, or dealt with Monsanto in the courts, the literature on soil says soil is an empty container for pouring chemical fertilizers into. It has no other role. It's empty. And recently, when Monsanto was challenging this Article 3J in the Supreme Court of India, the lawyer is saying the seed is an empty container. It's the chemicals we put into it that gives it life. Yeah. So this whole issue that nature is dead and we give life, we create value, is the deepest illusion that is causing so much destruction. But it is also goes hand in hand with saying that women are pure objects, are not subjects. Indigenous people are objects. That's why the Africans could be picked up and traded for slavery for the cotton fields. This objectification of autonomy and autonomous systems goes hand in hand. So for me, ecofeminism is nothing more than saying, no, nature's alive. Women are autonomous beings. They have brains. They just don't have reproductive systems. They have guts. And I think the word gut is a very important word for our time, to have guts, yeah? Because it reminds us systematically that we are walking biodiversity, and the health of the planet and our health is connected through biodiversity. And climate solutions come from this biodiversity. Just give you some data. 20 years of research we've done on our farm and in our field on soil. So basically, what's the climate problem? That the cycle of carbon and cycle of nitrogen has been ruptured. Yeah? These are cycles. Now we are pulling out 600 million years of fossilized carbon and burning it up. And there's too much. We are taking nitrogen from the air and pouring it into the soil, into the groundwater, into the atmosphere. So the soils is where organic matter belongs. Chemical farms have 14% less organic matter in these 20 years. And our organic farms have 99% more organic matter. That's healing the carbon cycle, pulling out that excess carbon from the atmosphere, putting it into the soil. Nitrogen, 22% less. You're applying nitrogen fertilizers, but your soil nitrogen is less because you're killing the organisms that hold the nitrogen and make the nitrogen. 100% more. And that isn't all. Zinc is 37% less, which is why there's zinc deficiency. 14% more in organic farms. Magnesium deficiency, 17% less. 14% more. We won't think, oh, what's zinc? Zinc is the single biggest reason for depression, deficiency. Magnesium deficiency, attention deficit disorder. We haven't even started to figure out the complexity of our beautiful world. But we do know simple solutions, like beginning with the seed and beginning with the food, can address the issue of hunger, of chronic disease, of desertification, of the water crisis, of the climate crisis, of the refugee crisis, and most importantly, by making us realize we are part of the earth, allow us to deal with the wave of hate and fear of our times. And that is why I talk about seeding earth democracy. There's a hand down here.
Thank you very much for being here. I'm very inspired about your work, and I'm also writing a book about the future of agriculture. I interviewed Monsanto, Bayer, and a lot of university professors here in Belgium. And I'm wondering how you feel about an army of professors teaching an even bigger army of students with all the things you've been saying that is destroying the world.
How I feel about it? I don't have feelings about it. I wouldn't waste my feelings on something like that. I have a reflection on it. And I think that is probably the single most dangerous aspect to the human future, because we've always had plurality of streams of knowing. And we've known that knowledge is diverse. I want to just share with you that the way we define mechanistic knowledge as knowledge has a particular time in which it was born. And Francis Bacon, who's called the father of modern science, actually wrote a book called The Masculine Birth of Time. And this is what he says: to merely exert a gentle guidance over nature's causes is not enough. We have to have the power to conquer and subdue her, to shake her to her very foundations. And he called this a masculine birth of time. And he talked about creating a blessed race of heroes and supermen. And then the Royal Society was created in 1660. He wrote this probably around the time the East India Company was being created. And in 1664, the secretary of the Royal Society said, the objective of the Royal Society of England was to raise a masculine philosophy whereby the mind of man may be ennobled with the knowledge of solid truths. And that legacy is what is being carried on in thinking of life, which is basically very complex. In this little seed is amazing self-organized complexity, because this little seed is going to become a plant. And that plant will have seeds, which will become plants. And one seed will give 1,000 seeds or 1,000,000 seeds. The family of crops called millets is because they have 1 million seeds. This is not a machine, no matter how much you might pretend to yourself, because it is not assembled from outside, it is not managed from outside. Machines are assembled and managed from outside. If they break down, they have to be repaired by a mechanic. Seeds are organized from within. All life is organized from within. And not only are they organized from within, their repair is within them. Of course, things go wrong, but they have ways to be able to fight off pests. So when you have a bunch, the poison cartel, make such huge money, how have their profits grown so much? A, they've grown because they're collecting royalties on seed. This is my big issue in India. And because I've saved seeds, including cotton seeds, last year a report done by someone else, because we've saved cotton seeds and we have a beautiful project called Fibers of Freedom, and I'd love some of the students to be engaged in these things. We do organic seed, organic farming, and hand weaving of cotton and hand printing with vegetable dyes. It's beauty all the way, and art all the way. And a report said that Monsanto's lost 11 million because we've started saving native seeds of cotton alone. Yeah? So they're harming, of course, farmers. But more than that, just at the time where the only way to face extinction is to know how the seed works, is the time the illusion is being replicated by armies and armies and armies, that the world is a machine, we've invented it, and poisons are safe, and you can hijack entire learning systems, research systems, media systems, government systems. Look at what is going on in England right now. Yeah? The first statement Johnson made was, we need to liberate GMOs. Because they're laws of regulation. The laws are not chaining GMOs, no. All they're saying is let's assess them. When assessment is treated as anti-science and blind release of hazards is treated as science, that is where the future threats are, to public health, to the environment. And I do feel we need to, democracy of knowledge is the foundation of the democracy of society. And that's why when we did the public hearing in tribunal on Monsanto in The Hague, I worked out in the contents, I said it's the assault on the seed and biodiversity, it's an assault on farmers, it's an attack on scientists, it's an attack on knowledge, and it's an attack on democracy. And all of this is at stake. And that's why we do need other narratives, and I am absolutely sure that the only way these armies of falsehood can be countered is by the creativity of the arts.
Thank you. Very inspiring. What just came to my mind while just also this question kind of came up is, I realized also I'm very lost in all of this, just like the simple act, you go to the supermarket, you want to eat, right? You want to get your food. And I've shifted contexts drastically. I was most of my life living in Jordan. We have land, we plant, you go out for your herbs. And then here I come, I'm horrified. I'm like, oh my God, what are we going to do? So I feel very lost. And sometimes I'm a bit skeptical. Like, is it all about just going out to, I mean, it's also like, I'm always confused. What do you do as an individual within your daily capacities and your energy and your basic knowledge, that, I mean, I guess people here maybe at varying degrees have an idea that we're in danger, there's something we should do. So maybe if I want to simplify the question is it enough to just like buy bioproducts these days, or to support an economy that perhaps relies on the small farmer and encourages others to maybe hopefully grow and come back, or is that an illusion or a delusion?
Yeah. Well, I began by talking about the mechanistic thought of, separate entities. And we've internalized this as human beings, that we are atoms in society, and then people like Margaret Thatcher said there are no There is no society, there's only individuals. And then because we think of ourselves as individuals separate from others, we seek solutions as in that atomistic form. And the easiest solution in atomistic form is more consumerism. But the consumerism itself is a reduction of our human capacity. Because the word consumer, by the way, consumption, any of you know what the word consumption stood for till the Middle Ages? TB. Remember? So-and-so has consumption. Tuberculosis. And suddenly it's been made into our identity. Having TB, yeah, and giving the planet TB. So I think the first step really is to realize that no matter how much we fool ourselves, we are interrelated. That the soil, no matter how the food that comes to you, the soil is in it, the water's in it, the sunshine is in it, someone's efforts are in it. And with that consciousness, we can shift those sets of relationships to systems that work, as I described, that work for the farmer, that work for the soil, that work for the climate, and that work for our health, because these are not separate aspects. They all work together. And definitely the issue of the science of it, the knowledge of it is important. But I don't think, we can make the shift without redesigning the economy. The 1% economy will hijack every labeling of bioproducts, which it already is doing. So you can't buy ecological regeneration. You have to participate in it. And the participation means you have to make that bit of effort to find the farmers. And I know even in this country, because I know some of them have come to us and trained, and I'm leaving some flyers here of our Earth University and the courses we offer. We've had people from Belgium come to us and then come back and start an organic farm and an organic community of distribution. This is happening everywhere. And we will have to shift from what I call, and I want to show this to you, just 2 graphs. We will have to shift from what I call the extractive economy that takes and takes and takes, ruins the earth, and dispossesses society, and creates what I call the inverted pyramid. And the big players right now in the food system are, of course, the old poison cartel. But they include now the Walmarts and the Amazons. And they include the new investment firms that run the billionaire money. 5 billionaires control half the wealth of the world. And the BlackRocks and the venture capital, they basically, Vanguard, are having their majority shares in every company. So when Bayer buys Monsanto, it looks like another company bought it. But when you look at the ownership, the BlackRocks and the Vanguards just shifted the chairs on the deck of the Titanic. That's all they did. And Microsoft is a big player. Bill Gates is a very big player in the future of agriculture. We have to move from there into seeding what I call circular economies. And because this is where your work is. I mean, I can just draw pathetic circles. Can you imagine what you with art could do with it? So basically, circular systems which work in constantly replenishing each other, the pollinator and the plants, the grower of food and the eater of food. This is where we build new communities. But we don't stop at one. They grow everywhere. And as Gandhi said, I do not see the world as a pyramid where the top crushes the bottom that supports it, but as ever expanding, but never ascending, oceanic circles, where the outermost gives more to the innermost. That the bigger has more obligation to give. And nothing good happens without effort. The Roundup mentality is good for killing, but the Roundup mentality will not nourish and fertilize a world that's livable for the future. So we have to make that effort. I make a lot of effort. And we've created those seed banks. I make a lot of effort to deal with this junk food invasion where our local foods are banned, as if our hands were the biggest curse. And I'm working with women on handmade, we say we got to resurrect the ability to be creative with our food, that food is art. You know what they're saying in the new language of fake food? When an unimproved technology is overtaken by an improved technology, and they're calling real food unimproved technology. And I think we need a new vocabulary which you all can create, that bad genocidal tools are bad art, unimproved art. They don't understand the relationships, because for me, art is relationships. It's patterns. And patterns create systems. And systems in balance create sustainability. So knowing how to shoot with a gene gun is not an art, it's war. Spraying Roundup is not an art, it's war. We have to shift from this militarized monoculture of the mind, that I call it, into a flowering of the biodiversity of the mind.
Good evening. Thank you very much. I work for the organic farmers, and I came here tonight because I needed some positive inspiration. A lot of farmers here as well, because we struggle all day to what you already said. And I was a bit disappointed that it was lots of the stories we know. I know, but I think it's important that everyone knows these stories. And I hope that this seed will also seed them and feed them to spread this message on the one hand, so that more people know about the problems and that you're not alone anymore. But also that there is, in Flanders you have lots of CSAs of farmers who are also working in a different way, trying to work with the seeds, but it's also a struggle.
Of course it's a struggle.
And I hope that when they go home, they take this message with them, that really look at the food that they feed themselves and in their family and in their friends, so that we can get some further and not wait tonight, hear the story and go home.
Yeah, I think when people, with their consciousness of what's their body, that it is, we are basically majority of other beings in us. We realize that the other is not an enemy. We don't have to exterminate and annihilate it. Can you imagine what would happen if we applied that logic to ourselves? But more importantly than that the only way we can get true nourishment with that knowledge that we have now of the gut microbiome is from real farmers and small farmers. And the fact that the organic movement is growing so fast is the reason industry is attacking it very badly, very severely. Our report on the future of food is really on that attack, where they found a person in India who says, organic is worse than a nuclear bomb. And GMOs are natural. So the fact that organic is having such a huge reaction is because it is the way people can relate to each other. People can create an alternative, and we'll have to do it. And that's why maybe we'll have to do the satyagraha that I had to do with the seed, That we will get good food to each other. We will buy good food from each other because it's necessary for our health and survival and freedom, I would say. There's one question there.
I find it just a little bit. In my view, there's a way to incorporate and see technology in a way as something that adds, like seeing biological life also as a sort of mechanical system of cells and that it's not in itself a bad thing, but we have to have a political or a government that has a view that doesn't make use of that to explored. But if we would just realize all things clearly, rationally, and develop knowledge and share knowledge about things, and not try to keep people down and convince them of stuff so that they just lead like simple lives and just want a car and just want to eat McDonald's, and they just become part of a machine of a political governmental system that's now going on, that is not in control, that has no conscience in itself. It's a machine that's going wild. It's just producing and producing and producing, but not thinking about how it is evolving, or where it's evolving to, or where the parts of this machine are evolving to. It just makes use of these parts to just keep producing, to just keep the people at the top. But if we would question, for me there's a big political thing in it, but I think we could reach all kinds of solutions through sharing education and sharing and finding ways to reinvest money fully in education, so we could have good talks about these topics, because we have big parts of society that cannot take part in these conversations in a meaningful way. Like we are having tonight the vote on the impeachment of Donald Trump. We're having the vote on Brexit. And it's all about this information, or information system has been hijacked by these corporations. And we are having trouble in making a movement, a counter movement to it, because we're not being able to develop a good group, or we are not being able to share our knowledge. We are not having the time to be sharing our knowledge. Our agendas are so full. We have to work. We have to survive. We have to. So, do you think there's a possibility of a creation of a global society that this young generation has? Do you think there's a possibility that this young generation that was born with internet, with a world with less boundaries, much more connected, that this generation can create a kind of new system, a new government, a new consciousness for this time?
Okay, 2 or 3 issues related to that. First of all, I think we need to contextualize the internet, because when we think it's the first time communication is happening, we forget that communication is happening in our gut all the time, and there's more neurological communication happening there than in our brain, and that's why it's being called the second brain. Yeah? That in the soil, between plants and trees, there is more transmission of information happening in the root of one plant than in our brains. So we need to recognize, yes, communication is important, but communication is taking place in many levels and in many ways. And the fact of the internet, you see, I'm of a generation that was born before the internet. And even though there was no internet in my time, our generation had a planetary consciousness. And we had international solidarity. Because that is a consciousness that grows out of your worldview. So a tribal peasant in India, or even a very, very devoted woman, when they pray to the sun, what are they saying? They're saying, please bless everyone in the universe. That's a planetary consciousness. On the other hand, I remember my debates at the Convention on Biological Diversity, where the Monsanto representative got up and said, the reason we have to have GMOs is we have created brilliant technologies that prevent the weeds from stealing the sunshine. Yeah. So what worldview you have shapes both your capacity of communication as well as placing yourself in the world. The worldview of the mechanical mind as well as the mind of greed is a worldview of separation. That's what I talked about. But it's a worldview that then only allows us to connect either through a global supermarket, you know, and that's why a lot of people have talked about, for the first time, we're going to be a global village because now junk food will be able to move around the world. No, that doesn't create a global village. It creates a lot of sick people. And yes, the tools of the internet must be used, but with full consciousness of how they're anyway being used by others. How is Mr. Zuckerberg using them? How is he stealing your Facebook messages? How is he selling this to Cambridge Analytica? How is Cambridge Analytica using algorithms to pick out messages of hate, which they did in the American elections, targeting women, targeting blacks, targeting Muslims, and targeting migrants? And that's what created Donald Trump, and that's why there was a Newsweek article that said, yeah, but yes, exactly. For the first time, we have artificial intelligence president, but we are getting artificial intelligence leaders, you know? So use the tool. But I think the issue of technology, and I've said this in the book, we've always had religions, but it's only in the European colonization, particularly the Spanish part, where religion was used as a civilizing mission. By the time it became British, it had changed form, because for the British and the East India Company, making money became the religion. Yeah? They didn't come around and saying you got to have churches everywhere. But the Spanish did that to every indigenous sacred site. It had to become a church. And if you did not worship in the church, you were a barbarian and you could be killed.
Nowadays, the capital is
Yeah.
money. If you don't preach the religion of
Yeah.
money.
But it's not just money by itself. After all, the tools of making money are very important. If you look at the robber barons whom I've called, who are the top 10? They either own technology firms or finance, like the Buffetts are in finance. And the interesting thing I've seen is a shift in vocabulary. So it was agriculture. Then we started to say industrial agriculture versus organic farming. And what did they come up with? They came up with ag tech. They just put tech behind anything. Like, there was this big piracy of basmati from my valley. You know, I'm in Dehradun, where we have the best basmati. And it was pirated by a Texas company. And this pirate called itself Rice Tech. Yeah? You just put yourself Rice Tech and you can steal. So I think it isn't just capital and making money. And I want to mention here that economy is derived from the same root as ecology, our home. It's supposed to be the management of the household. But now it has become how to make money. And Aristotle had called this chrematistics, the art of making money, as different from economy. But the way of making money in today's colonization isn't to go get other people's lands, but it is to get other people's minds. So all technology, in information technology and the digital technology, is control over data, invasion of privacy, and rent collection. That's why I call them the robber barons, and that's why I call it the new colonialism. That, I mean, in this book I've said, Bill Gates, to me, looks like a new Clive, who's, you know, the East India Company, or the new Columbus. But the difference is, Columbus was still 4 levels down, poor man. There was a god, there was a pope, there was a king and queen, and then it was Columbus. No, Bill Gates is God. I often describe GMOs as God, move over. We are the creators. We make life. So there's no God. And of course, the Pope, you write the rules, and you write the new rules of religion. Very simply put, religion has been connected to faith, then it was used as a civilizing mission. Money has always been around, but in our times, through the rule of money, it has been elevated to the end that we must seek. The billionaires seek it with ease. The rest of us must run after it and keep busy all the time to have no time. And technology has always been a tool, different tools, different places. For the first time in our times, it's been made a new religion, some tools. And because I'm in the part of the world where these tools get imposed, overnight our cash got banned for digital transactions. Overnight, our giving money to each other was made illegal. Overnight. So when a digital colony is created, we experience it. For you, you still experience it as freedom. We experience it as shutting down of our alternatives and our freedom. So technology is a tool, must be used as a tool, must be assessed, must be chosen, must be subjected to democratic norms, the point you were making. The minute the technology in the hands of the powerful becomes the way to rule and becomes the new way of accumulating wealth in undemocratic ways, then we must both create new tools and bring this under democratic control.
I just quickly want to ask, or build a little bit up on what you're saying about technology. Right now, humans have always tried to be more and more lazy, have machines do all the work for them. And right now we have already machines that do all the work on the field, so the humans can just sit behind the computers. And soon, farming will be fully automized without humans having to touch it anymore. What if they use this technology to have farming principles that are 100% with the good seeds, with respect for the microorganisms, but that it becomes fully automated? Would you have anything against this? And
It's a very interesting question.
It's democratic, it's everything, all the practices, it's no more
Yeah.
labor.
Well, for me, it fails the democratic test because I work with farmers who want to farm.
Yeah, but you won't,
I mean, we've got organic farmers here.
won't be forbidden to farm it with your hands, but the technology will just...
No, farming is with the hands. That's the issue. Oh, yeah, only. It's only when this body of ours, which is part of the earth, consciously becomes part of the earth again, that's agriculture. Because you can only care with these amazing hands, where I learned in the 70s, 45 years ago, how hugging trees can protect watersheds, yeah? For me, the reclaiming of our hands and reclaiming of work is the single most urgent issue of our times, both because it isn't that human beings wanted to give up work, but human beings were forced out of work. It's been taken away from them, and they've been made to believe that spraying Roundup is better. I see women rebel and say, no, I will do the weeding myself because I don't want my kids poisoned. And this food gives me nourishment. It lets me feed a goat, which helps me support an entire family. I think, if you think of the fact that fossil fuels just 300 years ago, colonialization is 500 years old. In 300 years, we fossilized our minds, yeah, into the mechanical mode. And in this mechanical mode, we've lost all synthesizing capacity, yeah? All ability to see patterns and holes. We've gone analytic, and there's a brilliant book that says it's this path that's going to create the annihilation of the human condition. Because you need the synthesizing brain to know what's right and what's wrong. But most importantly, the mechanical mind is also related to defining what progress is, what productivity is, what efficiency is. So on agriculture, when I was doing my work on the Green Revolution, I looked at productivity. I said, these farms are pathetic. They're producing nothing, you know. Some dwarf varieties of a monoculture wheat. I said, it's no biological productivity. That's why I evolved the criteria of biodiversity productivity. And then we worked to nutrition per acre. And if we measure in nutrition terms, we can feed 2 times India's population through biodiversity. Our farmers earn 10 times more. But the entire definition of productivity in farming is labor input. I'm not even reaching that point. I'm talking, giving you a reason, listen. Yeah? What I'm saying is, any system of production has inputs and outputs. The definition of productivity and efficiency is output per unit input. Ecologically, an honest productivity of agriculture would be how much output am I getting for inputs I'm putting in. In energy terms, industrial farming is a negative economy because it produces 1 unit of energy as output in food for 10 units of energy put into the system to produce the food. And when you get into factory farming and more intensive farming, it's 100 times input. But that's not what's measured. That would be the true measure of efficiency. How is productivity and efficiency measured? The input is only labor. So it's in the definition of agriculture that the fewer people there are on the land, the more efficient your system is, even though you're producing no nutrition, you're producing toxics, and you are on that path that's saying you don't need to work the land. So my research has shown that, I don't think I have any of my books here, that if you intensify biologically, you can keep going in intensification. When you intensify chemically, after a while your systems start collapsing because you're destroying the very conditions that let you have the food. The soil, the water, the biodiversity, the balance between the insect population, the pest predators, etc. But coming back to your issue of farming without farmers, is that this trend, see, first of all, because technology is a human product, all technologies are related to choices of parts. Yeah? You can either have chemical farming or organic farming. You can either have heavily industrial processed food or you can have fresh food. Always those choices are there, and in democratic society, they should not be shut down. But in the case of particularly the farming without farmers is related to digitalization. And the field of artificial intelligence and robotics would then not just apply to farming. It applies to everything else. And Mark Zuckerberg's convocation address at Harvard said, very soon, with the use of artificial intelligence, 90% of humanity will be useless. Yeah? So then you can go his way and the way of others in his league who say, oh, and of course they'll be troublesome. You know, if you have 90% unemployed people, how do you keep them out of trouble? We'll make sure they have enough money to have a smartphone to play games to keep distracted. Or the other is, no, we can have another model of an economy.
But then I think there's another solution. In place of just giving back again work to people, we can give education, put your work into the development of knowledge. I would think it's very much interesting to create a society based on the value of knowledge than on the value of money or on those kind of values.
Yeah, but knowledge has to be put to work. At the end of it, you know, you can have a very full head and you're sitting useless. What do you do with it?
You understand also that you feel you want to
No, of course you must have knowledge. Of course you must have knowledge. But knowledge without work,
because we are useless. I hope people are going to try to make themselves useful, but not in the way that the market.
yeah, but then you need those spaces to be creative, which is why it's an issue of democracy.
Yeah.
So knowledge as a democratic space also means the deployment of knowledge and translation of knowledge into human creativity. The creative, it could be you all as artists, it could be as an organic farmer, it could be as a teacher, it could be as a healer, it could be as a mother, of course, but that's exactly where the closure is taking place. And if we don't look at the 1% and see what they're doing at the time of closure, is the health system, the education system. I know it's going on in your country. These debates are as prevalent in Europe as they are in my country, as they are in the United States. That the systems that allow you to have knowledge are the systems being privatized. So it is an issue. But I think, you know, the fossil fuel age made it look like working is a curse. And I am convinced that reclaiming the right to work and the creativity of work, you know, I've never seen a hard-working peasant woman say, my work is drudgery. Never. Someone else says her work is drudgery. And that's external definition of the worth of your work. This capitalist patriarchal system defined growth in terms of a definition that says, if you produce what you consume, you don't produce. And that's how that extractive system started. Because if it was circular, then it's saying, no, it's not producing. So extraction is where growth happens. You know, you rupture the cycle. That's where growth happens. That's where GDP is measured. And healing the cycle is where well-being and happiness is measured. That's what Bhutan is doing right now. It shifted the economic paradigm. Said, we will not measure growth. But this issue of drudgery is, this as an externally imposed definition, I think is behind saying women don't work, even when they work hardest. But I remember a peasant. We were having a meeting, their mountain was being mined, and they were fighting, and they'd call me. And at a certain point, this tribal peasant got up and started to leave. And I asked, I said, where are you going? And he didn't say, to do drudgery work in farming. He didn't say that. He said, I'm going to beautify the earth. So it depends on the worldview you have in terms of how you see your way. And for me, autonomy includes the autonomy over our body. You know, women have always had the slogan, our bodies ourselves. But our bodies ourselves, to me, has to be extended to our body ourselves as the gut microbiome and its health, therefore the food issue. Our ability to work and be recognized with respect for the work you do. And unless we change this hierarchy of work, that those who gamble on our money, yeah, and they constantly become richer and richer and richer, that is actually not work. And let me end with a quotation, and I think we should be ending up now. Gandhi had articulated 7 sins, and one of the sins was wealth without work. And our 1% right now are collecting wealth with no work at all. Rent collection, royalty collection, and gambling. And it's time to bring the dignity of work, dignity of the convert. What's work? Work in physics is expenditure of energy. That's all it means. Now, expenditure of energy is what you do when you do a painting. I saw some of you were doing the installation, hammering the car. Yeah, it's huge expenditure of energy to lift that hammer and bang that car. I really believe the automobile, the love for the automobile has made our societies crazy. I think expenditure of energy in creative form in autonomous conditions, in the consciousness of our interaction and interbeing and interrelationship in an interrelated world, that is a very important part of future freedom. Thank you.